Many of us have a recipe or a dish that reminds us of our childhood. And for me, it's my grandmother's Swedish meatballs. And even though grandma is not with us anymore, I wanted to celebrate what would be her 95th birthday today by making her Swedish meatballs. Now, grandma did leave behind a book where she wrote down all of her recipes. There's just a little bit of a problem. You see, her Swedish meatball recipe, first of all, has two different recipes on the same page, and it's not exactly precise. She says such things as make a gravy and add a few allspice and other not so precise things, like you need to know beforehand what to do. So I start off by consulting my mother. Okay, you there, Mom?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as I've mentioned, Grandma has two different recipes on the same page. The top recipe says roll ground chuck or ground 7-bone roast in small balls, fry until lightly browned. The bottom one says add crumbs and all the seasonings you wish to hamburger, then fry. So the top one seems to make it sound like the meatballs are plain.
Yeah.
But the bottom one is really, I think, more how you normally would make meatballs.
Yeah, I would think you would put breadcrumbs in there.
Yeah, I mean, normally you season the ground beef and then use breadcrumbs and maybe egg as like a binder.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go with that one. Because the top one just seems like it's a very plain meat. So now the next question is, what seasonings would Grandma have put in her meatballs?
Basically, she used salt, pepper, sometimes a little seasoned salt. And never garlic, because your grandpa didn't like garlic.
Okay.
We weren't allowed to have garlic in the house.
No garlic. Which is interesting because the seasoned salt, I'm sure, has garlic in it.
Well, I don't know, but we weren't allowed to use garlic.
Okay. Then I'll have to decide what to do with the gravy. I know that she always had whole allspice in there, and both recipes say allspice.
Oh yeah, definitely allspice.
The top one says put a half teaspoon. This is the only measurement that she has in these recipes, by the way. A half teaspoon ground nutmeg.
Oh no, she didn't use nutmeg.
No nutmeg in the gravy. Okay.
No nutmeg.
Okay, so here's my mise en place for the meatballs. We've got 1 pound of ground beef, that's about 500 grams. And I'm using an 85% lean mixture. If anything, you want to err on a fattier mixture, so I don't think Grandma probably would have used anything more than 80% lean. You have 1 egg, the yolk broke, that's okay, it's all going to get mixed in. A 1/3 cup of panko breadcrumbs. And a teaspoon of seasoned salt. Now, this is, according to the conversation with my mother, all that my grandmother would have used to make meatballs, and in fact, even the seasoned salt would be pushing the envelope. You know, she was a 1950s suburban housewife, and back then you just didn't season things as much as you do today. Now, personally, I've had this combination before. I don't think it's kind of so-so, really. I want a little bit more oomph in my meatballs. I see that a lot of people online are using nutmeg. So I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg to my meatballs. Here's the mise en place for the gravy. I'm going to start with beef broth as the base. Now, for some inexplicable reason, in American grocery stores, liquid broth tends to be sold by weight, which makes no sense to me because no recipe that I've ever seen ever lists an ingredient for broth as a weight. In practical measurements, this is about 4 cups for this container. For those of you that live in countries with more sensible units of measurement, this is about a liter. Now, for me, when I'm making a gravy, the roux method always works best. So I'm going to use equal amounts of butter and flour here. I'm using half a cup of each. So that's about 60 grams actually of each of those. Now, Grandma always used whole allspice in her gravy. And I remember as a kid biting into these without realizing it and getting this very intense allspice flavor. So I'm going to use a half teaspoon of whole allspice. I know in her recipe she said a few allspice. I think it needs a little more. And the gravy always seemed to be creamy to me. So I'm going to do a half cup of heavy cream. That's about 150 milliliters. And depending on the consistency of the gravy, I may use more or less. It just depends on how it turns out. I need to get a better microphone for my camcorder, so I'm going to do voiceover for the cooking segments. As you can see, I've mixed together all the ingredients of the meatballs and rolled them into 1-inch balls, approximately 2.5 centimeters. And you want to brown these on all sides. So turn them periodically so that they brown. And while you're doing this, if you're coordinated enough, you can actually start the gravy. So I'm going to start the gravy in a different pan, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I've been cooking those meatballs at a high heat, and there's going to be a lot of bits that are burned, and not just brown, but burned, and it's not going to give a good flavor to the gravy. So I'm just going to melt the butter in the pan to begin with, and then I'm going to add the flour in and stir that with the whisk. This is what is referred to as making the roux. You want to cook the roux for a minute or two. That helps get rid of some of the flour flavor that you would otherwise normally have with the roux. After the flour has been cooking for a minute or two, you're going to start adding the broth to the pan while constantly stirring with the whisk. You want to make sure you don't have any clumps, so you keep stirring and you add the broth a little bit at a time, about a half a cup at a time, and it's going to create your sauce for you. So at this point, I've added the allspice and let it simmer for a few minutes, but the sauce is still kind of thin. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to add a couple teaspoons of flour mixed with just enough water to make sort of a slurry. And I'm going to pour that in to help thicken the sauce some more. And you never want to add flour just dry to your sauce, or you're going to end up with lumps. So that's why you always use a slurry. And then whisk that around, and the sauce should thicken up a little more. Now that the sauce has the desired thickness, I'm going to go ahead and put the meatballs into the sauce. They've been browned on the outside, but they probably still need a little bit more time to cook to get the inside done all the way through. So I'm going to simmer them in the sauce for about 20 minutes. Now that the meatballs have finished simmering for 20 minutes, I turned off the heat and stirred in the heavy cream, that half cup of heavy cream. And that's pretty much it. They're ready to be served. So here's the final product. I've got the Swedish meatballs with the gravy that I'm serving over egg noodles because that's the way Grandma always served Swedish meatballs. It is very traditional, however, to serve Swedish meatballs over mashed potatoes, so that is perfectly acceptable as well. And in the corner, you'll notice that there is a lingonberry garnish, also a very traditional thing with Swedish meatballs. So, end result, was I able to reproduce my grandmother's Swedish meatballs? No, I was not. And it isn't just because grandma left a recipe that wasn't particularly specific. It's because it's something a little bit more fundamental than that. Cooking is an act of love. And psychologists may tell us that it's all in our minds, but people can taste the love that the cook puts into the dish. And my love tastes different than everybody else's love. And that's okay. Grandma was a homemaker in the truest sense of the word. Everybody who came under her roof was made to feel like they were part of the family. So maybe what Grandma left me was not so much a recipe for Swedish meatballs, but a recipe for making a home. I'd love to know what recipes remind you of your childhood that you wish you could reproduce. Tell me in the comments. If you make Swedish meatballs, what is it that you do differently than what I did? And if you've never tried Swedish meatballs, I'll leave a link to my version of Swedish meatballs in the description below. I hope it helps you make a home.